Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, a man who's on the record as not much liking the work of Rodgers and Hammerstein, and I find watching their work is a pointless habit, or, as you might call it, an idle vice. Well, an unsubtle start for an unsubtle programme, because today we're going to be talking about The Sound of Music, where the song Edelweiss originates. But we're not going to be talking about it purely in the context of the piece itself. We're actually going to be celebrating a marvellous Christmas and New Year period on British television, where there were several examples of musical theatre productions. And over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at the two main productions that were on only a few weeks ago. They are, of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein's The Sound of Music and Stephen Sondheim and Julie Stein's Gypsy. And both were advertised as being live performances. But in both cases, they were done in very, very different ways. And part of the discussions over the next 3 weeks will be about the success or otherwise of how those productions worked as live performances. Now, live performances of musical theatre are nothing new on American television. In fact, since 2013, there seems to have been a new tradition developing whereby a Christmas offering of a live show is broadcast every year. In fact, in 2013, they started with The Sound of Music Live, exactly the same title given to ITV's production in 2015. American television, that's NBC in this case, then followed up in 2014 with a production of Peter Pan Live, both shows being shows from the 1950s, so going back for that nostalgic look, and two shows very much associated with Christmas, particularly in America, where a televised version of Peter Pan has been so much the part of the lives of so many people since it was written in the 1950s. But in 2050, last Christmas, NBC decided to update things with a live version of The Wiz. And I believe that Fox Television is getting in on the act because in January, i.e. in a couple of weeks' time, they're going to be broadcasting a live version of Grease. So there's this very healthy tradition of live musical theatre on American television. It's not at all a tradition in this country, and at last Britain has decided to jump on this bandwagon with specially prepared for television musical productions. In this case, the highest profile was ITV's The Sound of Music Live. Broadcast on the 20th of December 2015, which was the Sunday before Christmas Day, it in many ways kicked off the Christmas television schedule and was a proper piece of event television. But was it successful? And how does something as well known as The Sound of Music make a transition into a new medium? Well, that's a question I put to Tim Saywood. And so, fairly shortly after broadcast, he and I sat down together to talk about this brave and I think ultimately successful television experiment, The Sound of Music Live. Here's Tim Saywood. Musical Talk. Hello, Tim.
Hello.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Oh, and goodbye, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, adieu.
Oh, I wonder, could that be a clue?
No.
Oh, I've just stepped in a goat herd, which, as you know, is Cockney rhyming slang for something.
Yes.
I think the acute listener will have picked up that perhaps we're going to be talking about The Sound of Music in today's episode, but not just The Sound of Music as a concept, although we will be talking about its various iterations, but the big, high-profile live version of it, which was performed on ITV, the principal commercial television station here in the United Kingdom, just before Christmas. It was one of the big Christmas treats, wasn't it? The first live musical on British television.
Yes.
And they went for The Sound of Music. I suspect because it's a commodity which is almost entirely well known. Almost everyone has had some understanding of it or have seen the film or the stage show. It's an eternally popular stage show.
Yes, well, I mean, of course, traditionally it was perhaps not so much anymore, but it used to be a staple of the Christmas TV schedules, the film.
Oh yes, of course.
And it was sort of.
In fact, it is. It's on this week for New Year.
Right, okay, yeah. I mean, it's become a cliche pretty much since the 70s that they will show The Sound of Music at some point during the Christmas period on one of the main channels, and by and large they do.
For me, however, this was interesting because listeners will know I'm not a huge fan of Rodgers and Hammerstein, But I decided I was going to watch this. What I actually did is I recorded it and then took out all the advertisements, so I watch it in one fell swoop like a film. But you do know The Sound of Music. You've seen it before.
Well, I wouldn't say I know it that well, actually. I mean, I've seen the film once, all the way through, and of course, like everybody, I have the songs in my DNA.
Yes.
Or certain of the songs, anyway, just because you can't
avoid them.
You can't avoid them.
Well, we used to sing Edelweiss. Or Edelweiss.
Idlewild.
Yes, I think my
well
famous airport. We used to sing that in my primary school.
Yes.
And Do, Re, Mi, of course, and things like that. And indeed, culturally, it sort of slipped into the wider understanding. I mean, I think we've all seen spoofs of a nun running up a hill, about to burst into song, and then quite often bursting into a different song. I know the Goodies have done that. I know that the Pink Panther films, there's at least one Pink Panther film where the opening credits, the Pink Panther is dressed as a nun, right, clearly doing Maria up a hill, as it were, if you pardon the expression.
Excellent.
So you have seen it.
And there's a whole French and Saunders spoof, isn't there, of the whole thing, pretty much.
And indeed, of course, it's become massively popular in the last, I would say, 15 years with the sing-along version, which...
of course.
And people turn up in fancy dress. I was once in Leicester Square because it was on at the Prince Charles Theatre one Saturday, and I saw this incredibly tall man, essentially a drag queen, because he was dressed in that slightly over-the-top drag queen way, dressed in a dress made of curtains.
Yes.
But for comic effect, he had left the curtain rail in.
Yes. Yes,
so it touches a lot of cultural sensitivities. So, but what did you think? I mean, you decided you were going to watch it.
Yes.
Why did you choose to watch it? Is it because it wasn't on television?
On, and I was in.
Oh, really?
Well, no. I saw that it was on, and I thought the major reason I watched it actually would be to find out a little bit more about the stage version, because the major difference between this and the iconic film version was that they said, well, what we'll do is we'll do the songs and the repertoire from the stage version. So I think which was a wise decision, because I think direct comparisons with the film, which is iconic in many people's minds,
yes,
and a lot of people will know backwards, because they had a lot of problems with threading the projections in those days. It would have been an invidious comparison, I think, yes, because it's such a...
It'd be a carbon copy
it's
and
a beyond
one
criticism sort of a film, and certainly musicals. So I think they made a good decision to do that. I had no idea it was live. I mean, it was called The Sound of Music Live, and then when I started watching, I thought, well, this is just a studio-based production. I don't know in what sense this is live, with not realising blithely that, in fact, what I was watching was happening in a studio in London, I assume, at the very second I was watching it. And
it was a proper live performance. How nice of them
to put that on just for me. I wonder if anyone else is tuning in, I thought.
I mean, I think you've immediately touched on one of the things I found most strange. I didn't know what to expect. When they said The Sound of Music was coming on live onto British television, what I expected to happen is actually what we got a few days later when they televised Gypsy in a London theatre. That wasn't live, although it was a recording of a live show. I assumed we were going to have cameras in the Palladium or some enormous theatre, and then we'd be watching essentially a telecast of a stage, but we didn't get that. We didn't get, as you say, it's based on the stage version, but it was a televisual interpretation.
It was a studio-bound, which you don't see these days.
Well, that's the thing. It felt really old-fashioned.
For that reason, yeah.
When I came to the end of it, I thought to myself, I've just watched a slice of 1980s television, because even the external shots were studio shots.
That's right.
The garden of the nunnery, the garden of the Schloss, things like that. That's all, and it has to be, if it's live, they have to run from one scene to another, and they have to be close to each other. That's fine. But also, presumably it's the old 4-camera system.
What it took me back to was the era of the not black and white. They could have, perhaps if they wanted to really be retro, they could have done it in black and white. But was the old Judy Garland specials.
Well, the nuns come out well in black and white, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Was the Judy Garland Christmas sort of TV special type of things?
Oh yes.
That sort of thing where they would just do a few numbers and it would be set in some. I don't know, for Judy Garland, but implausibly large sort of lounge,
The Bing Crosby shows were like that, weren't they?
Yes.
Yeah, welcome to my enormous house.
Probably for Bing, he probably did own a house that big. But anyway, the point is...
He didn't film it,
and then when you cut to outside the door and there would be some carol singers, and it was that sort of a feel. And as you say, the last studio-bound thing I can think of in that vein at all, and this was shot on videotape as it would have been in those days, was Porgy and Bess, the version of the Glyndebourne Simon Rattle production. And the way that they did that was they took the studio recording of Porgy and Bess, Simon Rattle, Cynthia Hayman, and so on, and they mimed to it on a studio set. And
how did it work?
It didn't really work. No. It was the sort of thing that you thought, well, you could have gotten away with this in, say, the 60s or 70s as a TV special type of feel. But by the well, it must have been the late 80s, if not the early 90s, when they did this. And
It already looked ropey.
it was a bad idea. And also, opera, when people are miming, I mean, as much as they were probably doing a fantastic job of miming, there's something about the way the Adam's apple moves and all of that sort of stuff that you're watching someone actually really singing their heart out or not, and you could tell that they weren't.
I thought they were left with a Hobson's choice of how to approach it, because they had chosen not to televise a stage production.
Yep.
They had chosen, quite rightly, because they were doing it live, not to do it in a cinematic way. And modern British television is cinematic in its attitudes. It's no longer televisual, it's cinematic. So it was left with the televisual, and the televisual died in the 80s and 90s, which is what we're saying. However, there are things you can do with television which you can't do with stage, and you can't actually comfortably do with film, or it would look very silly if you did film. So there were a couple of interesting directorial moments, I thought. For example, right early on, when we were in the Abbey, and we see the Mother Superior comes walking down the middle of the courtyard, there seems to be a bit of odd choreography when the nuns sort of cross behind her. But the camera was suspended from above. It was an aerial shot. And there were a couple more of those. Not many, just a few, during the course of the production. There was also one later in the enormous hallway in the Captain's Schloss, when, I think it was at the end of the party, the children had gone to bed, and I think we were just left with Maria and the captain. So the camera had certain angles to get all the action that had taken place in the hallway, plus a few of the other rooms in the garden. But then suddenly we got a completely different angle, because all the actors except two principals had gone, which meant there was an opportunity for a camera to come out of what turned out to be a doorway off the stair landing, which we'd seen earlier, where the housekeeper sometimes comes out. So they'd obviously shoved a camera through there. And suddenly we had a view of the hallway of the captain and Maria talking through the banisters of the staircase.
Yes.
And these wouldn't work very well, I think. If you were doing cinematically, you'd be a bit more adventurous, but you wouldn't really do the aerial shots and things like that.
Yeah.
If you were doing it from stage, and then you've only got the full-on view because you see the proscenium arch look. So actually, they were trying to do something interesting directorially, but they were having to work around the live
that hadn't
constraints.
been done since the 50s or the 60s.
Yeah,
when
which is
you
new
had
for
camera
us.
scripts and you did all these sorts of things.
Yes, camera scripts. That's the point, isn't it?
That's right. It would have been done in that way, because obviously, film, well, not necessarily, but the tradition of film is that it's done single camera, and so you do everything as many times as you need to get all the different angles. And this was clearly multi-camera work, which is
vision
how
mixing.
TV used to work. So there's live vision mixing, and everybody would have had a camera script. You'd have said, right, well, at this point we need camera 4 to be over here, and at this point we need camera 5 to be over here, and this one's going to have to. And in fact, I think the moments when I realised it was live, and there were two major ones, I think, that were sort of visual in-vision mistakes, and this, of course, was much.
This is when Maria's pants fell down and she tripped over screaming, "Ow, I've landed on my ass!" Or did they cut that?
I think they cut. Well, you couldn't
Live.
cut anything,
No,
but
quite,
I think maybe during the commercial breaks or in feeble imaginings. I'm not sure, but anyway.
Sorry, the two live moments.
One where one of the children fell over. I think it was Gretel.
Yes.
She infamously, and of course instantly, Twitter reacted to it. She fell over a suitcase or the guitar case that had been placed either correctly or.
But actually, the woman playing Maria was very good.
Yes,
so
she
did
improvised
what
her way out of it.
a governess and a mother would have
Gretel?
done. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so that was one moment you knew it was live. And there was also, I think, a very noticeable crash zoom on Herr von Trapp's face. Like, there was when clearly the camera hadn't reached his position or her position and got into the zoom that they needed to get into. So those are the two moments when I realised, yes, okay, this is actually one of those sort of crazy studio productions. Being a veteran, and you and I are both veterans of watching creaky old television, where it was not necessarily done live, but it was certainly,
as live. Yeah.
It had to be done as live because of the constraints of the day, and we've seen a lot of things where like, cameras get knocked and moved around and stuff like that, and they just sort of carry on as if nothing had happened.
Well, there were some other things as well. Actually, there was because I was listening to it through headphones, and once again there was a scene in the Abbey. Mm-hmm. And I think it might have been, once again, the Mother Superior. She does a lot of walking up and down that courtyard, that Mother Superior.
Yes.
But she was walking
she
up.
had nowhere else to walk.
Well, that's true. Yes, her office was in the courtyard as well, I
Yes.
noticed. But anyway, she was walking across the courtyard, and the camera was in front of her, and you could hear the camera. Because they'd done a very nice step. The floor was flagstones.
Yes.
And you could hear the camera on its wheels moving across the flagstones. It was very, very minor.
Well, the audio must have been a huge challenge for this, because, of course, the singing was done live. And actually, you could tell. And because in film musicals, the way it's done, unless it's Les Mis, basically, is that you pre-record the tracks beforehand with orchestra or with band or whatever, and then mime to the tracks a bit like I was describing with Porgy and Bess. not the case here. And of course, in a live version, they're singing
Yes, of
live
course.
with a live orchestra or with a click track or whatever. In this version, they were singing live, but the orchestral tracks were pre-recorded, so that somehow these had to be blended. And again, quite a challenge for a sound editor. And we were talking about the sound challenges just now. But that's how they did it. They basically had foldback into the studio. I don't know how much would have been. I mean, in order to do the dancing and everything like that, I mean, presumably they might have had. I couldn't see earpieces.
No, I was looking for microphones and I didn't see them.
Yeah, well, they definitely had microphones because they each had. I was just reading they had 2 microphones each, one in case that one
other
went
failed,
down.
yeah.
And I think even then it went a bit wrong. I think at least one character was unmiked at one point.
There was one moment when somebody was very quiet, which made me
Yes.
wonder if actually there were sort of boom mics, but clearly not.
No. Apparently they all had sort of personal mics, but yeah, one couldn't spot earpieces, so they were either very well disguised, and there were definite close-ups there of everything, or it was just sort of what would you call an ambient foldback, in the studio.
Yeah.
And then they had to sing along to that, but quite a challenge, I would have thought, because you can't have the foldback too loud going back into the studio, because otherwise it would start to interfere with the pre-recorded soundtrack that you're
Yes.
feeding direct to the audience. So I don't quite know how they did it, but jolly well done on them for doing it and staying in time
Well, there were no technical
and singing the
glitches.
right songs at the right times.
There were no technical glitches on the sound at all, though. I didn't know it wasn't. There wasn't a live orchestra. You're quite right. I imagine that actually it would have been very difficult to have all those sets and room for an orchestra, because it sounded a fairly full and lush sound.
So again, from what I've read about it, there were at least three sound stages. Again, words to conjure
Yes.
with from the yesteryear of Hollywood, isn't it? And they actually, to get from one to the other, you had to go outside. So during all the ad breaks, basically the actors were frantically doing their changes, and B, literally transporting themselves across the waste ground or wherever it was that they had to get in between. I don't know where it said it in East London. I don't know if it was like at 3 Mills or something like that. I don't know.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because we're back to that hybrid of televisual productions of the 1970s and 80s and stage, of course, that idea of going off into the wings and put your costume on and
Yes,
coming back.
yeah.
That's all very theatrical. But you mentioned, interestingly, there were close-ups, and there were close-ups. Now, close-ups is the one thing you can't really do on the stage.
Yes.
That subtle face acting, which is not really a part of most stage performances, is part of television. In fact, television is much more intimate than almost any of the other mediums. Film, of course, it is as well, too.
Sure.
But that was one of the great lessons that was learned by the actors who transitioned from stage to television in the 40s and 50s.
Yes, they had to do
The small detail and the ticks and the interesting
and
things.
those like Ethel Merman who never made the transition.
Yes.
But,
She did them up and show what you mean.
But physically made the
Yes.
transition, but perhaps performance-wise never did. Yeah.
So there were moments where they, it was first and foremost a televisual production, and quite a feat, really, actually, when I look at it.
Yeah, no, it was a. I mean, there is a sort of big why do it that way question, but I mean, some of the downsides were that again, it felt very old-fashioned because it was all backdrops and it was all
Not many mountains in East London.
Well, indeed, the hills are alive. Well, there's a ski slope in Beckton, but decided not to use that. But the hills are alive with the sound of music. That famous sort of introductory song from Maria, which of course goes right at the start.
Well, you lose the scope. That's what you get with
Well, she was in
television.
a sort of little wood, wasn't she? Presumably at the top of a hill, but we couldn't quite tell.
Well, actually, I think that by this stage she'd come back, because the nuns say, "Have you seen Maria?" And someone said, "I
Yes.
haven't seen her all day."
Yes, and
then she's lying on a
outside.
tree almost immediately outside, almost immediately afterwards. But then she walks into the
nunnery, yeah.
the nunnery, yes. And indeed, so she's actually at this stage in the garden. Now, this could pay off plot-wise later on, because, spoilers here, but when the Von Trapp family are trying to evade the Nazis at the end, they hide in the garden, where almost, apparently, the nuns say, no one ever thinks to look in the garden,
Yes.
including, apparently, the nuns.
Well, it must happen all the time to them.
Well, apparently Maria only has to go 2 or 3 paces into the back garden to become invisible for a day.
Exactly.
But I, like everyone else, because I have not seen the stage play, I have not seen the film, but I know that you have that marvellous, huge scope, presumably with a camera on a crane,
helicopter.
where Julie Andrews, dressed as a nun, runs up the hill, building up to the sound of music. And therefore I was massively surprised that when she does open with that song, it's actually quite a low-key, almost folk number for the local district.
Well, you know what it reminds you of, doesn't it? It's Oklahoma. Bright golden haze on the meadow.
Well, it doesn't remind me that, because I've not seen that either. It's Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Well, that's famously because they open it and Curly singing it is off stage. So he just
right.
so it's a deliberately you've got this Aunt Ella doing whatever she's doing, I forget now, turning butter or something, and she's doing nothing on stage, and then this voice just comes out from nowhere, and then eventually Curly walks on, oh what a beautiful morning, so and it was considered very or I'm told it was considered very innovative at the time, because of course normally you'd have a whole lot of chorus girls come out and really give it like, hello, you're all here for a show.
Oh, no,
that famous old Rodgers and Hammerstein number.
I'm going to do that
that they cut from Oklahoma.
But I'm going to take you back several generations, because actually, do you know who innovated that? As far as I'm aware, it's going to be Gilbert and Sullivan, because in the Yeoman of the Guards, which if you like is the serious of their operettas, all musicals at that time, including all the GNSs, opened with the chorus number, as you would expect, exactly as you said, and sets the scene. In this, you start in the Tower of London with one of the senior matrons who works there at a spinning wheel, singing "When Man Is Born," and that was considered amazingly. That was strikingly different. No one had done that.
Every generation rediscovers it.
Yeah,
I wonder when this generation's going to. I can't wait.
But once again, we're back to that. Having chosen to do it televisually, they did it very impressively, I think. But let's talk a bit about the piece itself. Now, remember, I was coming to this fresh the first time, and therefore I think structurally it's quite strange, because you start off in the entire Abbey sequence at the beginning is all preamble, setting up a character.
Yep.
It has no real plot function at this stage. Obviously they do later on, but at this stage they're just setting up Maria, really. And then she moves into the Von Trapp family as the governess and doesn't really hit it off at first with her employer, to the point whereby she's actually sacked before very quickly being reinstated.
Yep.
So there's no sense of romance or relationship going on here. The first twinkling of a relationship is when Rolf, the telegram boy, turns up, and he turns out to have a bit of a flirty go with Liesel, I think her name is, the elder girl who's 16 going on 17, and a bit of a flighty nonsense young lady she turns out to be, I may say. But so
you mean because she doesn't go steady with him?
No, because she turns
a Nazi.
She puts the whole family at risk later on, doesn't she, silly cow?
Yes.
But at this stage, that is the first real sense that there's a relationship going on. So actually, for me, not knowing the plot and not reading the runes, I saw that as going to be the romantic relationship that was going to be the principal one of the piece.
See.
And they even, bearing in mind, it's a very gentle flirtation in that scene, because at this stage he's not yet a Nazi, he's just a telegram boy.
Sure.
He may have inklings in that direction and leanings, but they have this little flirtatious thing in the garden, they sing their song, and then they do this quite nice choreographed dance in the garden, which shows their simpatico, I think. That's the way I read it, because they were symmetrical, in fact. It was a nicely choreographed piece. And then he completely disappears in terms of plot until quite later on, until he's come back as the Nazi telegram boy. By now the Anschluss has occurred and he's got his swastika armband. And then the next time we see him, which is presumably only 3 or 4 days later, according to the plot, he's dressed in the SS guard costume. So he's had a lot of promotion, I must say. But he turns up 3 times. The first time he looks like he's going to be the romantic lead and is given a lot of those cues and hints.
Yeah.
The next time we see him, he delivers a threat, which is actually all about the main story, to show that the captain, although he's happy in his relationship, is now in danger.
Yeah.
And then finally, he delivers the last real danger, the kind of will they, won't they jeopardy at the very, very end, when silly Liesel decides that she's seen her telegram boy dressed as a Nazi and thinks the good thing to do is to present herself to him. And therefore, it's only because of his good nature, bizarrely, but they get away. They get away because of the kindness of a Nazi, is how this resolves.
Yeah.
Very strange, I think. But structurally, that's very odd. And then
it's not his Nazi side, is it?
No, it's the real side, I
the
suppose.
side that loves Liesel.
The telegram boy side.
Exactly.
But so that was how it looked like it was going to develop. And then suddenly, of course, as I say, he doesn't turn up at all. And the relationship all becomes between the captain and Maria, which I can understand is going to be the drive of it. But actually, Maria doesn't take it easily, does she? The other thing is, she starts off as being desperately wanting to be a nun, not wanting to be. And then she runs away back to the nunnery when she thinks that she's doing something wrong by falling in love.
Yes.
So she doesn't look like she's going to be the one who ends up getting married.
No, and of course he's already
flirting.
Elsa is very much lined up and the more natural fit for him, and so. couple of things about her character, of course, because I mean,
Elsa.
Yes, I mean she's present certainly in the other ones, but a little bit more musically so here, because there are numbers that were cut from the film that do appear here, along with the Max character played by
Alexander Armstrong in this. Yeah,
Alan Armstrong, very different man. And those, of course, make a little bit more of a feature of her sort of sophistication and her sort of lack of naivety, if you like. But of course, also hers and Max's sort of moral susceptibility as well, because they both sort of say, "Well, you can't stop this happening, this Anschluss. It's inevitable." So so I think that's actually a bit of sophistication that was sort of erased from the film a little bit, because although they're both obviously about the same topic, the film and the stage versions, and I think this one just edges the politics a little bit more, and also just goes into sort of more ambiguous territory.
Well, once again, let's talk. There's something about Elsa which I think is interesting, because the thing about The Sound of Music, it seems to me, is that even though I'm not a fan of Rodgers and Hammerstein, it turned out I knew most of the songs, and it does appear to be pretty much hit after hit after hit.
Yes,
except there were two songs which really stood out as being inferior to me, and poor old Elsa ended up singing them both.
Yes.
There was the, what's the point of us getting married kind of number, we're both rich and successful.
Yes.
And then there was the later number, which is what can we do to stop Nazi encroachment number.
Not an awful lot, yeah.
And they were just, to me, maybe it's lack of familiarity, but they seem very much more range rather than A range.
They seem to hark back to the sort of Frimmel type of, that sort of what would therefore be judged as sort of Viennese sophistication that befitted those particular characters' milieu, and whereas Maria's songs inhabit the world more of the folk song, basically, or the nursery rhyme. So I think that's where that difference comes from, and so I suppose they're quite successful evocations, and of course also. Most of the, as you say, the hits of The Sound of Music, are beaten into one's head from a very early age. It's certainly people of our generation, because I think we were growing up within 10 years of the film, or a little earlier in your case, obviously. But
why? Thank you.
And so of course you couldn't escape Edelweiss even if you wanted to. It's
much as Mum
tightened on you very much like an Edelweiss. So there's that, and what else? Do Re Mi, of course, which is a classic classroom song.
Yeah. Although, what was really interesting to me was hearing the verse, which I'd never heard before in my life.
Oh, right.
So I heard all this stuff, and I thought, this feels like it's going to lead to something I know, but I don't know it yet. Oh, my goodness, it's that thing.
Right, yes. Oh, okay. I didn't know that, yeah. Oh, you mean the verse at the start, at the very beginning? It's a very good
never
place
heard
to start.
that.
Really?
No.
You have, actually.
Well, you just sang it to me, but thank
you.
No. Well, all right, but it didn't stick in my memory. No. I mean, and we didn't do it at school. When we sang it at school, we started off with Do, a dear, a female
we did
dear.
The whole thing. We did the entire
really?
score, yes, in 4-part harmony. No, I'm lying. That's completely rubbish. But they do very well, don't they? They learn music in a matter of 2 minutes, as often happens in musicals.
Well, it's also, there is a sense that there was music in the family when the mother was alive.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the children are technically, presumably, in mourning. I know the father is, but they're in a very different kind of mourning, aren't they? There's also, I thought...
what a beautiful morning.
Hey! I thought there was quite an interesting thing at the beginning when you see Captain Von Trapp at his worst. Now, he's in mourning, he's unhappy.
Yes.
And he has withdrawn into his military life.
Yes.
And he's ordering his children around as though they are sailors or soldiers. He's an admiral, so presumably they're sailors. They're also dressed in blue. But he treats them as resources rather than as children. And at the beginning, but at the beginning, I suspect you're supposed to think, oh, he's a militaristic influence, he's a bad man, and we all know it's set in that run up to the Second World War. Certainly, in this case, the Anschluss of Austria by Germany in 1938. So there's this sense that actually he's the bad man, and then you suddenly realise that as the politics develops, that actually he is a simple.
There are worse men than he.
Yeah, he's a simple military man. He's not a political man. It's not being a military man that makes him bad. It's the politics behind some of those people who end up being the first people to support the Nazis after the Anschluss, which is the problem. So he is contrasted, but it's quite a sophisticated thing, it seems to me, to be asking an audience to identify that. At first he looks like he has the trappings of Nazism, which we think of as a militaristic movement, but actually then reveal that the difficulty here is the politics of Nazism rather than the militaristic aspects of Austrian politics.
Obviously, the American audience have 1950s would have been familiar with the military-style father, I mean, which is very much a thing over there, particularly perhaps less so here.
Well, there's military academies over there, aren't there? I think so.
Well, I mean, there is a tradition of formalism within sort of families where you address your father as sir, and those sorts of things. That's perhaps a little bit more germane to American life and then perhaps Austrian life at that time than so it wouldn't necessarily appear to be a political thing, is what I'm saying, to that audience, but for him to be that way. But yeah, he is a more sophisticated character, and I think that was one thing they were quite good at, really, was just sort of, doing something that was a little bit less cardboardy than musical theatre had attempted up to that point.
It's also a very positive interpretation of the nuns. I mean, so often in culture in general, institutions like abbeys and nunneries are seen as very archly conservative for obvious reasons.
Yes.
I'm not here to judge or not judge the church in question. It's obviously a Catholic nunnery, but
it goes beyond the scope of this programme.
I think it does. But
next week,
but the Mother Superior, I know she has to be she has that right balance between twinkle and authority.
Yeah.
So she's the voice of reason. She's also a voice of support, and she's ultimately supporting and helpful. She's nothing but a good egg all the way through.
Yeah.
That's quite an interesting interpretation, I think. I suspect. I mean, it's obviously in the text. I don't think it's down to Maria Friedman's very excellent performance, but
yeah. I mean, she's. Well, if anything, she is a sort of unqualifiedly good character, I suppose.
Yeah.
So in a sense, she's slightly less complex and interesting in that way. But yeah, she clearly speaks with experience in a helpful way.
And what did you make of the fact towards the end, when the Anschluss in Austria takes place, and they cut to not live footage, to Pathé newsreel kind of footage of the actual invasion of Nazi soldiers, real Nazi soldiers moving in black and white, with subtitles explaining what's going on.
Interestingly, over Christmas there was a thing about the origins of Dad's
Army.
Yes, and similar thoughts occurred, really, because I mean, they famously, Dad's Army had a title sequence initially that was based on archive footage and showed sort of the real war, as it were.
That's the 1968
European war, and then they replaced that later on with a sort of more jocular sort of animation, that was a little bit more, that was a little bit less on the edge. I mean, to me, it fell into that same category of where they used, for example, footage of Herbert Morrison at the beginning of Billy Elliot. It contextualises the thing. That's what it was doing there.
Yes, but Herbert Morrison didn't go around invading people. He was a fairly decent egg.
Yes, well, I mean, arguably, but.
His shelters were fantastic. What are you talking about?
But I mean, the point is that they were saying that this did relate to something that happened in real life. I mean, I don't know. Sound of Music is, for all its sort of political pretensions, is a pretty fluffy show.
Oh, Lord, yes.
We're not talking about cabaret here. It is quite a different sort of a beast, and so perhaps that was a little OTT, but I guess they had to cover up some kind of. They had to cover that ground as well, and they clearly couldn't do it with on-stage action because they hadn't got the scale or the scope in 3 studios to do it, so they had to find some other way.
Also, a lot of actors did have to put on Nazi uniforms, and uniforms are harder to put on than a goat herd costume or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. So I don't know. I mean, otherwise, what could you have done? Cut to Simon Sharma doing a lecture on the. So I guess
if he sang it,
they did the best possible thing they could have done under the circumstances.
Now, The Sound of Music in general. Let me ask you a question. A governess meets children and a difficult husband, and charms the husband by impressing the children. Rodgers and Hammerstein's score. Which musical am I talking about?
Oh, could it be The King and I?
Is this a remake of The King and I?
Well, it is in that respect, isn't it? I mean, not only, and actually, when you look at the film, even more so, because the song I Have Confidence in Me, well, where does that go in the place of? It goes in the place of I Whistle a Happy Tune on the boat on the way there, that in The King and I. So yes, it clearly is structurally quite a similar thing. I mean, more successful in my view. I think The King and I mean, apart from sort of
the race politics,
which
makes
race politics
more difficult these days,
suffers from a lot of, and also fewer subplots, which of course also I think is quite helpful in The Sound of Music. It just holds the thing together more. I just think there's a little bit more joie de vivre as well in The Sound of Music, really, which you don't so much have. I don't know what the German for joie de vivre is, but I should have to look it up. Lebenliebe or something like that. I don't know.
It's a word that takes 20 minutes to say, I imagine. Yeah. But so was it then ultimately successful for you?
Yes, it was actually. I discovered to my surprise that I quite liked The Sound of Music the first time I watched the film, and not just because of the iconic songs. It was a bit like when I first saw My Fair Lady. That completely took me by surprise, and I assumed I'd hate it, and it was very enjoyable. And this version I also found...
It was My Fair to middling, I think.
That's right. And this version I found very persuasive too. I mean, it had its limitations. I rather enjoyed the nostalgia aspect of its being studio bound. I found that sort of, again, a pleasantly sort of backward-looking experience, basically. And actually, funny enough, a few days beforehand, I had happened to get off YouTube one of those old Judy Garland Christmas specials and watched it all the way through,
right.
which was what set up that resonance for me. So I think I was primed to enjoy it. And as you say, very good performances. And there was infamously a similar experiment in the US 2 years ago. On the 5th of December 2013.
This is a live version of The Sound of Music on American television.
Music on American TV, which was roundly, well, I don't know if it was roundly panned, but it certainly had a mixed reception, not least in its lead. And that really wasn't the case here. I mean, there weren't really weak links. And, I thought the kids were very good. And yeah, I know overall I had a good time watching it. I'm not sure I'd want to see it a lot more times, but...
I'm going to have to tell you that I felt the same way. I was very surprised because, I have to keep saying this, I hold Rodgers and Hammerstein responsible for a lot of damage to musical theatre because of the slowing of tempo. I will say this, every song, even the speech marked upbeat ones, are at best medium tempo. They're very lugubrious, I find, Rodgers and Hammerstein
Goat
scores.
Herd is quite speedy. I mean, that's not exactly presto, I suppose, but...
it needs a patter song somewhere.
Yeah, I was going to say, they don't really do patter songs per se. Certainly not in this, anyway.
But I didn't dislike it. I actually enjoyed it. I got to the end of the... incidentally, it was on for 2.5 hours on television. You took out the advertisements, which is the way I watched it. It was precisely 1 hour and 57 minutes. So it was 2 hours, essentially.
Tolerable, yeah.
I found that actually...
Which is short for Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Yes. I wonder how much was cut there. Well, of course, you don't get on the stage version... which you would in stage, everyone clapping for 5 minutes after every song.
Yeah.
And it did just go bam, bam, bam. I know there were advertisements as well, but that's without the advertisements of 2 hours. So it was fairly nippy in its direction of the drama. It didn't hang around at all. There was no sort of gaps, no hanging around moments. But I liked it. I would watch it again. As you say, I wouldn't watch it a lot. Whether I would want to watch the film now, I don't know. Whether I'd want to go and see it on stage, I don't know. But this... for me, will be my Sound of Music. Whereas for everyone else, it's another Sound of Music.
Yeah.
And so, if ITV or anyone were to do further musicals, I would watch.
What do you think would work in this genre? I mean, it would have to be something fairly well known for a kick-off, but...
You mean in this televisual version rather than...
Yeah, what would suit a studio-bound production? In some ways, The Sound of Music is not the first one you would reach for, due to the absence of those aforementioned mountains, but...
Well, there are some which I think it would be almost impossible to do. I mean, West Side Story, you'd expect the choreography. You know, what's the point of doing a live version of West Side Story? I can see...
I can imagine them being able to do that, actually, because a lot of the spaces are very confined. They're city spaces, and so, you know, even Under the Highway has like constraints in the film version. It looks like studio set, in fact.
I think it depends which audience you're going for, because I think it's quite telling. This was on Prime ITV television, which is one of our mainstream television channels. Gypsy, the telecast of a stage version, was on BBC 4, which is a not terrestrial
for
channel.
Things that are slightly less well known.
Yes, it's a slightly more artsy channel. I think if you were doing another one for BBC 4, you could do something like Candide.
Yes.
But you wouldn't put that on ITV. I think ITV's got to be something everyone's heard of. But to be something everyone's heard of, it's got to be one of the greats. And if you work your way through the Rodgers and Hammerstein canon, you know...
Or Carousel, maybe.
Oh, but it's awful. Yeah. And Oklahoma's too... I don't mean this rudely, it's too American, actually.
Well, too wide, too many planes and wide spaces required, I think, for Oklahoma really to work.
The King and I think, for reasons we've already discussed, will be very difficult to pull off.
Sure.
I'd like to see Allegro, but that's never going to be put on because no one's heard of it. No. Cinderella might be... Because that was designed as a television musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein. Yep. That's a good Christmas one as well. And funny.
You could get away with Bat Boy, I reckon, in that genre. I suppose the effects might be a little hard to carry off, and the flashbacks.
Yes, but there are ways of doing that on television. That's not.
Rocky Horror, I think, would very much work in that genre. And of course, there was recently the David Badella version was done, you know, as a telecast of the stage play and worked very well.
And I must say this, if you can do it on stage, you can do it on television. I think, this is wishful thinking, how to succeed in business without really trying.
Oh, right. Okay,
well,
yes.
but
because it's set in these small
in
environments.
sets, isn't it? Yeah.
And maybe Singing in the Rain, which would be kind of ironic, wouldn't it, with all the dubbing and all the live.
Well, of course it would. The problem with Singing in the Rain is, of course, it was originally a film musical. It's not a stage musical first.
No, but again, it's of course a lot of the action takes place on sound stages,
Yes, it does, I suppose.
abandoned or otherwise,
And we know you can do A Rainy Street because Morecambe and Wise have done it.
Yes, exactly.
And if there's anything more Christmassy than Morecambe and Wise, I've yet to see it.
No, exactly. Oh, well, maybe Singing in the Rain for a future one, and hopefully not The Wizard of Oz. I can see that being an absolute disaster.
Oh yes, yeah. Some things are almost too iconic, aren't they?
Yeah, well, you could do it, but
You'd have to spend a bit of money on it, though.
Well, there we are.
Yeah.
Challenge for ITV1, not our problem, luckily.
But please do another ITV one.
Do tune in for another episode of Musical Talk when Thos and I will do The Sound of Music live. A dream that will last all the days of your life.
What was that, Ethel?
That was a preview of what the delights that listeners can expect when we do it.
Yes.
25th annual Putnam County Spelling Bee. That would work perfectly.
That would be fantastic.
As a TV studio.
But that once again, BBC 4, because no one's heard of it. When I say no one, mainstream-wise.
You're right. Yeah, it wouldn't be big enough.
What's Sondheim? Into the Woods now you could do on television?
You could do Into the Woods.
Because
you could do
that's
Company, I think, would probably be the best.
Sweeney Todd? Bit
maybe.
gory for Christmas.
Well, I mean, I saw a fantastic Sweeney Todd that was done in a pie shop.
Did you?
Not that long ago, yes. There was the Tooting Arts Club, and it was the best production of pretty much any musical I've ever seen. But more about that another time.
Yes, and how many people bought a pie at the end of that?
Well, you bought the pie beforehand.
Yeah, you would, wouldn't you, for Sweeney Todd?
I didn't. My stomach wouldn't handle it, but it was a charming feature of the whole thing.
Tim, as always, thank you very much for
whatever it was that I did.
Yeah, I don't know, but I'm going to pay you the dough that I owe you, plus the Ray and the me.
Yes, yes. Well, you've been a drop of golden sun all the way through this, I have to say.
Just a quick word on a lyric, which I find really objectionable, because Oscar Hammerstein, he's got his faults, but actually on the whole, there was a bit of craft actually in the opening number, on My Favourite Things rather, when I notice he talks about winters but turns into springs because it has to rhyme with things. No, I like that, because he uses winters.
Well, there's a couple we'll come on to those. There's a couple I'm not that keen on in that. Eyelashes. It's one of the very rare examples of not particularly good scansion in Rodgers and Hammerstein. Yeah.
Well, I liked springs because it rhymed with things, where most people would say, I think, idiomatically, winters that turned into spring. But actually, grammatically, it worked. Anyway, I was very happy with that. What I don't like is in Do, Re, Mi, which it's a beautiful conceit, that song, actually, finding a definition for each of the tones of the scale, if you like. Yes. Except La, where he singularly cannot think of anything at all and has to go up with a note that follows so. I think that's just...
Would you have had an acronym for Los Angeles? I mean, what would you...
Well, I'm not saying I have a solution. Well, it's obviously one of the indefinite articles. It's an indefinite article in French. What are you talking about?
Probably, that's true. It's probably the periodic table somewhere, isn't it? Laudanum or something like that.
What an interesting...
I drink with jam and bread.
And presumably the next one you go off your head. Yes, it is laudanum. But anyway, a
which
fluff lyric.
You hallucinate. Do.
Any others that you do or don't like in the score?
No, I think they're very successful by and large. I mean, I think one of the cleverest ones is somehow So Long, Farewell, Auf Wiedersehen, Good Night, etc. Because, of course, you have to remember to do it in the right order so you get your right rhyme for your succeeding line. And I'm always impressed when the kids manage to not get that right. Although I must admit, I did see an amateur version once when someone did So Long, Farewell, Auf Wiedersehen, Goodbye. And the line is, I leave and heave a sigh and say goodbye or good night or whatever it is. And in fact, it was... he did I heave and leave a sigh. And that's all he left.
Yes. Leave me something to remember you by.
Exactly.
Then sweep it up. Well, overall then, I think we're both saying that The Sound of Music was a great success. We would like to see more. We can't work out which one it should be. But when they do it, we'll talk about it.
We'd like a show to follow, so.
Very good. Yes. Now get off. Good night, Tim.
Good night.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Goodbye.
Musical Talk. Tim Sayward there giving us his characteristic insights into The Sound of Music Live, ITV's unique piece of British television, because it was the first time that a piece of musical theatre had been performed live on television. So here are some facts about that production. Here's the cast. Maria was played by Cara Toynton, Captain Von Trapp by Julian Ovenden, who I believe used to appear in Downton Abbey, and so you might say should be singing Climb Every Downton. Ugh. Alexander Armstrong was Max, Catherine Kelly was Elsa, Maria Friedman was really quite masterful as the Mother Abbess, Mel Gedroic was the housekeeper, and Paul Copley was the butler. And the director was Mel Gedroic's sister, Cokie. And in conversation, the director had made it plain that she was aware of the American version of The Sound of Music, which had been broadcast in 2013. It hadn't really got very good reviews, although it got tremendously high viewing figures. I believe 90 million viewers on first broadcast. But the British version was quite specifically focused upon the drama of the rise of the Nazis. And the director said specifically that she wanted to focus on the love story, which was in the context of that German takeover of Austria in 1938. This is obviously a tone note that was given to the cast, because Cara Toynton, who played Maria, said it's not a fairy tale, but it's turbulent and traumatic. And it was no mean undertaking either. It cost ITV £2 million to put on, it's estimated. But then again, it did have a cast and crew of over 400 people, 177 costumes, there were 17 cameras, that's a lot of cameras to be coordinating, and the cast and crew rehearsed for 37 days. It also had to be chunked up into bite-sized pieces of 10 parts over its 2.5-hour live running time in order to allow for advertisement breaks. But of course those breaks also gave the actors a chance to change their costumes and move to another set. Apparently the 3 sound stages were linked only by open air, and so ITV had been hoping very much for good weather on the night so that actors didn't get soaked as they ran from one sound stage to another. Fortunately, that's what happened. It was very dry that night. And to make sure that nothing went wrong, everyone had 2 microphones, there were backup tracks, and there were even understudies in case any of the actors got ill during the performance. Imagine changing the cast halfway through a live television broadcast. And of course, costume changes are no easy thing. It happens all the time in theatre, but then again, you're not running to another stage when you're in the wings of a normal theatre. The director had made great pains in pointing out that there was one wig that took at least 34 seconds to put on. Now, 34 seconds might not seem a great deal of time, but actually, in terms of theatrical changes, which have to be kept shorter than the gap between the performer going off and coming back on again, that is a tremendously long change. Some other interesting facts. The floor of the Abbey was actually based on the floor of Westminster Abbey, so they've gone to the very top for that. And all the trees that you see, although they're indoors, they were all real trees, except for one. I don't know which one wasn't, but I rather imagine it's the particularly shaped one that we first see Maria on as she's lying on the trunk, singing The Sound of Music. So, how was it received? Well, as you heard, both Tim and I thought on the whole, it was really rather a success. We weren't in any way put off by the seemingly old-fashioned television grammar that we were being presented with, but that was a problem for some people. In fact, most of the criticism of the piece, where there was criticism, was not of the cast and performances, which were almost universally considered to be good, but more to do with the fact that the show was neither fish nor fowl, in the sense it was neither theatre nor cinema. However, I think that's short-sightedness on those critics' parts, because it wasn't trying to be either stage or cinema, it was trying to be television. And as we explained very carefully, I think, in the episode, the grammar of television is now seen as rather old-fashioned because we don't use it very much, preferring to borrow that of a cinema for most television programmes. Mark Shenton wasn't a great fan, but Claire Alfrey in The Telegraph placed great praise upon Cara Toynton's pivotal performance as Maria, describing her as bringing a refreshing earthiness and grit to Maria that made the passionate, unconventional novice feel thoroughly modern and accessible. And funnily enough, that's exactly how I've responded to it. As I said in the programme, this is going to be my Sound of Music. It's not caught up in the stage conventions of an old show, and it's certainly not caught up in the now quite dated film version. It is a modern contemporary version of an older story, aimed squarely at a 2015 audience. It had to be accessible and engaging to a modern audience, and I think it was. So, the final question, and it's the one that hangs over all the shows that we're going to be talking about in the next 3 weeks, which is, why do it? Some might say it's worth doing just because it's not been done before. But of course, in the modern world, particularly in the television industry, nothing is done without the idea of either ratings or money, and very often both. And I think there's a very telling statement from Elaine Bedell, ITV's Director of Entertainment and Comedy. She said, and I quote, "Live shows are increasingly important to channels like us, providing unmissable big events which don't feel the same if you don't watch it live." And this, I think, is television's response to catch-up television options, which are driving down overnight viewing figures. Whereas particularly commercial television stations need to get people to watch advertisements. And the best way of making sure they cannot avoid advertisements, which is a lot easier to do if you've recorded a programme or you're watching on catch-up television, is to get them to watch the broadcast on their televisions as it goes out for the very first time. It means you just can't miss the advertisements. You can't fast forward through a transmission as it takes place. And so I hope that the commercial imperatives will see more of this kind of thing in the future. So, all in all, The Sound of Music gets a big thumbs up from Musical Talk. And we'll be returning to this particular production of The Sound of Music, The Sound of Music Live on ITV, in 2 weeks' time, when I'll be giving you the lowdown of my as-it-happened experiences and responses to the broadcast from the position of someone who has never seen the show before. Because until this broadcast, I had never seen The Sound of Music either on stage or the film version. I do hope you'll find that interesting. Next week, however, is the other way of doing live musical theatre on television. This was BBC4's adaptation of Gypsy, and they chose a very different approach to their live broadcast. So tune in again next week and hear Tim Sayward and me talking about that and the differences between Gypsy and The Sound of Music in the approaches taken by the television broadcasting companies, and of course about Gypsy itself, which is one of the great musical theatre shows of the 20th century. Well, for the time being, I think I've climbed every mountain. I've also made sure that I've given a goat herd one of my favourite things, but this is neither the time nor the place to be discussing that kind of thing. So instead, I'll sign off with the traditional words of goodbye. Auf Wiedersehen, farewell, plus any others you want to add, and perhaps you could make a song about it. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Sayward. Copyright Musical Talk 2016. And don't forget to follow us on the social networks.
Stop a moment, someone blow my nose.
I thought you were going to helpfully tell us what the German of Joyce Vive was.
That's it, I just pronounced it twice.
Thank you for your consideration.
That's right. Just making the most of the gap.
Everyone's a critic.
Sorry, continue.